In the last video, we talked about the aggregate consumption function, and we're going to make a simplification and assume that right now aggregate demand is just equal to consumption plus investment, and that investment does not depend on current income, right? Investment can depend on a lot of things. It can depend on the interest rate, and it can depend on future demand, but since investment takes time, we can pretty safely assume that it doesn't depend too much on current income. So what we're going to do is we're going to graph aggregate demand with aggregate demand on the vertical axis and output, or GDP, Y, on the horizontal axis. And we're going to just take our consumption function, which is this bottom line, and add investment, which is just going to be a fixed amount. And so that gets to the top line. And then we're going to have a 45-degree line, which represents our equilibrium. And our equilibrium concept here is just that output, Y, our horizontal variable, is equal to what we buy, aggregate demand, which is our vertical variable. And so the place where they cross is our equilibrium. So in this case, it's marked as point A. And the reason that they always cross is that because we have assumed that the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1, and that autonomous consumption plus investment is greater than 0. And so we're starting above the 45-degree line, but then we're going at a slope less than 45 degrees, and so we will cross the 45-degree line. So that's our equilibrium, where output, GDP, is equal to aggregate demand. So then what happens when something changes? So let's imagine that investment falls. Okay, so here we are at point A, and for whatever reason, businesses decide to invest less. Maybe there's bad news from abroad, maybe there's something else going on that makes them pessimistic, but they decide they don't need to invest as much. Well, they drop, in this case, by 1.5 billion euros. Investment falls from I to what we'll call I prime. Now you could say, all right, well, so GDP is just going to be $1.5 billion lower. But what we have to remember is that one person's spending is another person's income, right? And so now the businesses are spending $1.5 billion less on computers, on factories, on trucks, on whatever it is they invest in. And that means that people's income is lower. And when their income is lower, they're going to consume less. And so if they consume less, that means that consumption falls as well, right? In this case, it will be 1.5 times the marginal propensity to consume, which in this graph is 0.6, but we're not going to worry too much about that. It falls to point D, and then we get into the same cycle, right? We're spending less. That means income goes down. That means that spending is going to fall even farther. And eventually we'll get to an equilibrium because the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. Each of those steps is getting smaller and smaller, and eventually it converges. And we have a new aggregate demand curve, right? And so the only change in this aggregate demand curve is I prime. C0 is the same. C1, the marginal propensity to consume, is the same. But because I prime fell, we move from A to Z, right? If we had only fallen by 1.5 billion, we would have ended up at C. But because of the multiplier effect, we end up all the way down here at Z. So in this case, it's 2.5 times the 1.5 change, and that's the value of the multiplier. So 3.75 divided by 1.5 equals 2.5. And mathematically, that just comes from the value of the marginal propensity to consume in this model. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in a later section. It's in one of the Einstein sections in the chapter. So what's going on is that we get this bigger fall in output than the initial fall in aggregate demand. And that's because one person's spending is another person's income. The fall in investment leads to a fall in aggregate demand. That leads to lower output and income, which leads to a further fall in aggregate demand and income. And eventually, we end up at our new equilibrium. So this means that the total change in GDP, right, that we care about, the total fall in income, the total fall in output, can be greater than that initial change in aggregate demand. And that's because of that circular flow, right? Circular flow of expenditure, income, and output is just another way of saying one person's spending is another person's income. So if our multiplier had been 1, then we would have just gotten that 1.5 billion euro fall. But in this case, our multiplier was larger than 1, and so the total fall in GDP was larger than the initial fall. Now, remember, this can work positively too, right? So if businesses gain confidence, right, all of a sudden they're like, oh, we need this new technology, we're going to invest, invest, invest. That increases people's income, that increases their spending, that increases output even further, and so we can have a positive effect on the multiplier as well. So what's going to change the consumption function? Well, remember there's two pieces of the consumption function. One is the slope, the marginal propensity to consume, which we've been labeling as C1, and that depends on credit constraints and consumption smoothing, right? Those two things are both going to affect the marginal propensity to consume. So the more people are able to smooth consumption, that's going to affect the size of the MPC. If they can't smooth consumption, then the MPC is going to be larger, which means the multiplier is going to be larger. If they can smooth consumption, if they can borrow, if they're not credit constrained, then the MPC will be relatively lower and the multiplier will be relatively lower. Other decisions can shift the aggregate demand curve up or down, right? So people may choose to save more. So this is what happened when the housing market crashed in 2006 and 2007. People saw the equity in their house fall and they started saving more to try to build their wealth back up. That shifted our aggregate demand curve down. Other changes in wealth could shift it down. Changes in future expectations can shift it down. So anything other than current income will shift the aggregate demand curve, and a change in the marginal propensity to consume will change the slope. So in the Great Depression, what was going on is that we had the roaring 20s, so times were good. We were at point A, and we had a big drop in the stock market, right? So there had been a big stock market bubble that popped. We ended up with a fall in wealth, a fall in investment spending. That we also had then a fall in autonomous consumption because of the fall in wealth, and we ended up, down here at point C at the trough of the recession, which was in 1933. That was one of the longest recessions, if not the longest, that the United States has had. It took almost 4 years, 3.5 years, to go from the business cycle peak in 1929 to the business cycle trough in 1933. And so a lot of that was due to uncertainty, the stock market crash, bank failures, pessimism, collapse of credit, nobody's lending. And so we ended up with a big multiplier in the Great Depression, which is one of the reasons that it was so bad.